Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. This week, we're going to take a close look at Germany. I can't tell you how many conversations in Chatham House come back to Germany. It seems all roads lead there. We've got the challenges facing Europe's largest economy. I was struck on a recent visit to Munich how the wars in Ukraine and Gaza have thrown into sharp relief the contradictions in Germany's foreign policy, as some see it, as well as the stability of its post-World War II identity. On Israel, the memories of the Holocaust loom large for Germany's political leaders who have provided unqualified support to Israel since the Hamas attacks of 7th October, yet that feels not quite right for many younger Germans, for whom addressing the suffering and devastation in Gaza looms very large. We'll also be talking about the challenges to Germany at home. The economy is facing recession. The car industry is in a quandary about how to embrace electric vehicles and competition from China. The leadership of Chancellor Olaf Scholz is being questioned, and relations with France and President Macron, so crucial to the running of the EU, are somewhat strained. Well, I have a great team to talk about all this. Joining me down the line from London, in fact, but often in Berlin, is John Kampfner, the former head of our UK and the World programme here at Chatham House and the author of Why the Germans Do It Better. Welcome back.
Thank you very much.
Great to have you here. Joining us from Paris is Mujtaba Rahman, the Managing Director for Europe at the Eurasia Group Consultancy. Welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you. And back on the podcast this week, also from Paris, is Georgina Wright, a Senior Fellow with the think tank Institut Montaigne. Welcome back, Georgie.
Lovely to be back.
Let's start with Ukraine first. How can we best define Germany's approach to Russia and Ukraine? John, I wonder if you could take us into it.
It's bizarre. If you look at the figures, Germany is in the lead, if that's not too crude a term. I was looking up the Kiel Institute's Ukraine tracker only yesterday. Germany has provided 17.7 billion euros of aid to military aid to Ukraine, compared to Britain, which is always regarded as its sort of staunchest European supporter of 9.1. That's more than coming up to double the amount.
Let me just say, when you say the lead, you mean the lead in Europe, not including the US.
Yes. And yet the perception is, and there is some justification to it if you look beyond the figures, that Olaf Scholz is always following and never leading. As one member of the government put it to me, he sees himself as a football referee trying to bring competing people together rather than the team captain. He's always one step behind. I've seen him with Volodymyr Zelensky when Zelensky was receiving the Charlemagne Prize several months ago in Aachen in Germany. He was trying to win over Scholz, trying to produce some sort of empathy with him. And yet Scholz just managed to scowl, clean his glasses, tie up his shoelaces, and never quite give that sense in a way that famously or infamously Boris Johnson did, and then Emmanuel Macron with his flourishes. And so you get from Germans this complaint that, look what we're doing, and we're not being given the credit for it. Compare it to France, which has given a paltry amount, and yet Macron, having gone from let's engage Putin at the beginning, let's not cast him out into the cold, is now all about let's put European boots on the ground. And the Germans are furious about this. And yet so much of it, I would contend, goes back to the personality of Scholz. He started so well with the Zeitenwende speech, presaging not just €1 billion extra in military spending, but a whole new change in the German outlook. That has sort of happened a bit, but reluctantly.
And the Zeitenwende speech you mentioned about 2 years ago was when he said, look, this is a historic turning point because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it's going to change Germany's position. And yet you're saying that the response to that has been a bit equivocal.
The immediate response was extraordinarily positive. And the irony to that was that Scholz's personal poll ratings went through the roof, rather than this perception of Germany always shying away from difficult decisions. There was a sense of he had the country with him and he could have carried the country with him. Instead, he has done the classic case of always looking over his shoulder, and he has therefore lost momentum, he has lost goodwill. And at the same time, Germany is, as I said, by using those figures, actually giving a lot more than it's given credit for.
But it has paused just at this point on whether it is going to give the missiles that Ukraine particularly wants. And so that's where it stands at the moment?
It is where it stands. And again, this is the classic Scholzian way of not seeing an advantage, not seeing an opportunity where it arises, worrying that this would be perceived by Putin and Russia as Germany directly becoming involved against Russia, with all the memories of the Second World War heavily in the mind. And yet more, I would say, realistic members of the German government, such as Baerbock and Habeck, the two key figures from the Greens in government, Baerbock being the foreign minister, realize that it is absolutely essential that Germany does this.
Midge, what do you make of this ambivalence? I'm going to call it, not in any one person, but among the German government as a whole and how it's presenting itself.
Yeah, so Bronwen, I would broadly agree with John. I think if you compare and contrast the approach to Germany before February 2022 with the approach that came after, before 2022, there was tremendous naivety, I think, within Germany about Russia's geopolitical intentions. There was no trust in Putin, but there was a strong emphasis on avoiding a serious conflict with Moscow as long as possible. There was a very strict separation of business and geopolitics. Nord Stream 1 and 2 were seen as strictly business projects, which was obviously naive. And the annexation of Crimea did not lead to a fundamental reassessment of German thinking about the bilateral relationship, although it did mark the turning point in defense spending. Now, if you think about the relationship with Russia today, so after February 2022, the relationship with Russia has been destroyed. The energy links have been fundamentally decoupled. Germany has massively increased defense spending, although it's unclear whether Scholz will sustain the 2% forever, and that is long-term sustainable. They have made defense spending exempt from spending cuts in the context of the difficult fiscal negotiations for this year. And there is some discussion about reforming the debt brake to allow for further borrowing to address the fiscal gap for the purposes of defense next year. So that's all positive. It does seem to be dawning on German political elites that there is a double threat from Putin and Trump, and that warrants a big change. But they haven't yet mustered, in my view, the strength to draw fundamental conclusions about Germany's own leadership role, not only in Europe, but also the world. I think Germany finds it very hard to switch from being a strategic follower to a strategic leader that takes risks and is willing to lead the pack. So yes, spending is increasing, but it's easier to change spending than it is to change the ingrained cultural convictions of post-war Germany.
That is a really good way of putting it. As you said, the money has gone up. When we're talking about 2%, that's 2% of GDP and is the target for NATO member countries, though the US would like them all to go beyond that. Georgie, how does this look from Paris? And I'm thinking of what John said at the beginning of Germany not getting the credit for what it's done, and France and President Macron having started off talking about talking with Putin, now swinging right round.
I think the Franco-German relationship, look, it's I think possibly one of the closest bilateral relationships that exist in the world. And, this was really set up in the aftermath of the Second World War. And it was designed in such a way that you continue talking even when you disagree. The problem is the relationship is so institutionalized, i.e. the two governments talk, different levels several times a week, that actually when they really fundamentally disagree on policy, it's sort of they continue talking, but they don't really address their differences. And all these differences were festering, and then now they're out in the public. And, Midge has written on this before, and lots of other people have as well, that you really do need a strong Franco-German engine to really transform the EU. And at the moment, it simply isn't working for a number of reasons. I think there's understanding in Paris that Germany is basically living through the biggest crisis since the Second World War. I mean, we're talking about war returning to the continent, that actually economic integration doesn't necessarily bring you peace or democracy. Actually, you do need a really good army and you need to spend a lot on defense policy. I think where there is some frustration in Paris is the sense that Germany is thinking about all of this only within Germany. And actually, if you think back to 1984, when you had Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand, who made this big speech. They were talking about transforming France and Germany by transforming Europe. And those two transformations had to happen side by side. And there is a sense at the moment that actually Germany is thinking about how it addresses its economic problems, its industrial problems, because of course we know that the war in Ukraine has meant high energy costs, so it's much more difficult for German industry to plan long term because it's just too costly for them. So we're talking economic, industrial transformation and big questions around security. And then on top of that, you have a German government that's formed of three parties that don't necessarily see eye to eye on pretty much anything. So they're having to, it really depends who you talk to within the coalition. And sometimes there's a joke in Paris that there's at least one coalition partner we agree with, but we barely agree with all of them. But yes, and I think there's also justifiable criticism in Germany of France's kind of change and transformation vis-a-vis Russia and the war in Ukraine. And I think France has, and particularly President Macron, has been on a big learning curve where he himself has realized that you can't really talk to Putin and that's not going to change things. There's been a massive shift on EU enlargement and NATO enlargement, and also questions about how you think credibly about European security, which doesn't mean completely alienating the United States or doing it independently from the United States. So a lot has happened in France as well. But if you look at numbers, as John said at the beginning, Germany is spending a lot more to support Ukraine than France is. And France will say, well, we send better weaponry, but fundamentally, they're still lagging behind.
And as Mitch was saying, this to make all those changes would really mean a huge change in mindset, not just of money. John, I wonder, we'll come back to the economy in a second and what that means, but I wonder if you could take us into the Israel Hamas conflict and what this has meant in Germany. I'm very conscious of something someone said to me at the Munich Security Forum. And he said, look, my father fought in Germany for the war. And for my generation, we are with Israel forever. That was just part of the kind of Germans we are and the kind of Germany we want the country to be. But if you go down a generation or two, it's really not so simple. People look at Gaza and the destruction, the loss of life there. You might have people with Turkish or Syrian elements in their family. Things are changing, he said. Does that ring a bell for you?
To use two rather long compound nouns that beloved of Germans, Vergangenheitsbewältigung and Erinnerungskultur means coming to terms with the past and the culture of memory. Much talked about, always has been for a long time in Germany. And yet what's occurred to me, and it's a link between the Ukraine question and the Israel-Gaza question, is for the first time I've come to the view that actually it is much less developed in Germany than I had hitherto believed.
That what is much less developed, sorry?
The sense of coming to terms with the Second World War and its legacy, for two reasons. With regard to Ukraine and Russia, briefly, the sense of never again, which is nie wieder, the standard German term from Second World War, it is, I keep on contending with people, fundamentally misunderstood. Never again has been wrongly interpreted by many, particularly in the Social Democrats and on the centre left, as never again war. At which point I remind them, actually, it was Britain that declared war in 1939. Germany did not. What Germany did was invade and produce a heinous dictatorship that threatened Europe and the world. And the sense that war was always the enemy has pervaded, and Georgina spoke about that, the sense of reluctance to come to terms with that sense of hard power for good outcomes. That is something that Germans are only now beginning to understand. You take that on now to Israel and Gaza. The extent to which the Holocaust, the Shoah, permeates everything is entirely there. But when I wrote a piece recently for The Guardian saying that actually Germany is paralyzed by its guilt for the Second World War and cannot act objectively when it comes to Israel, I was subjected to very strong criticism, including from people I very strongly respect, arguing that no, that's not the case. Germany can deal with Israel objectively. My argument is that I don't think it can. I think it has tied itself up in incredible knots. The coalition government, which actually agrees on this by and large, seems to be quite out of kilter with public opinion, which is not particularly different to the growing pro-Palestinian feelings or sympathies in the United States, in the UK, in France, and elsewhere. And yet Germany, through the whole Staatsräson that Angela Merkel famously declared when she was speaking in the Knesset, the idea that it is one of the fundamental tenets of German society and politics always to be at Israel's side. I think that the country is now in deeply, deeply riven by the past.
Midge, you were talking about the change in mindset that had or hadn't happened. What do you think of what John has just said?
On Israel and Gaza, I broadly agree, Bronwen. I think the government very quickly decided to side with Israel. They remain largely supportive of Netanyahu's government. That is nuancing a little bit now as a result of the humanitarian crisis we're seeing in Gaza. But fundamentally, I think the government within the European Council remains Israel's staunchest ally, and I don't see that changing, even at the cost of domestic unpopularity. Bronwen, if I may, could I just very quickly come back to Georgina?
Absolutely.
On Ukraine, because I thought Georgie was quite generous, actually, to Germany, and I perhaps could just reflect a slightly stronger sentiment that I've picked up in Paris this week, which is fundamentally Germany does not have a policy on Ukraine. I think that's the fundamental problem. And Germany's contribution, which is, as John said, in the order of 17.7 billion, is frankly here seen as something of a displacement activity. So you can provide that amount of financing to Ukraine. And as a result of providing that financing, you don't need a policy. I mean, there is a very clear analysis and a very clear policy that is now coming out of the Elysee. It is that Russia must lose. The Ukraine theater is an existential threat for European security. In Bratislava last year, Macron opened up a pathway for Ukraine's NATO membership. They're a major champion of internal reform within Europe in order to integrate Ukraine over the medium to longer term. And there is also a lot of support, either through Breton or directly by Macron and championing Kaja Kallas's idea of more common financing at the European level to support a Eurobond or some such to ultimately sustain and advance Europe's geopolitical ambitions. And so there is a very coherent set of policies and worldview that Macron is now advancing. And in response to all of those strands, all we have from the Chancellery is complete silence. And I think that is the major problem. If you look at the reaction around Europe to Macron's boots on the ground comment, there is either enthusiastic or silent support. But by and large, the comments have gone down well. Germany is more or less completely isolated on that question. It has no worldview, no response. And I think that's a major problem that I think will need to be addressed if Scholz is to ever play a leadership role in Europe, or indeed if his reputation is to recover within the EU on the Ukraine question, but also more broadly.
We're going to come on in a minute to the relationship with France in more detail. But John, just take us through what has happened to the German economy. It's a source of much distress at home, and this sudden recession, the sight of the car manufacturing industry, almost the demand for it moving away to China rushing ahead with electric vehicles and so on. What is happening?
Well, the classic pithy, disparaging line about Germany is outsourcing its defense to America, its energy to Russia, and its trade and growth to China, none of which are looking good, to say the least.
And that is quite explicitly how Americans in Congress put it.
Yeah.
They've borrowed our defense for a long time.
And not without justification. I mean, I always like to say that Germany's greatest strength is self-criticism. Its greatest weakness is self-flagellation. And there is an enormous amount of both going on at the moment, but with some considerable justification. When this coalition came into power, one of its main plank before sort of 6 or 8 weeks later, Putin invaded Ukraine, was digitization and modernization of the economy. That was going to be at the heart of it. Germany's broadband speeds famously slower than Albania's. You can be having a phone call anywhere in Berlin. You can guarantee if your phone call lasts more than 20 minutes, you'll be cut off 4 or 5 times. And that sort of sense of the country slowing down is very much there. The economy, Germany was the only country to contract among major OECDs in 2023. Its growth predictions from the IMF are lower than others, only a tiny bit lower than the UK's, but still lower. And so the country is feeling sour. Strikes. When I was in Berlin last week, one day it was the trains, next day it was Munich and Frankfurt airport, the day after it was Berlin and Hamburg airport. The sort of sense of the country being very, very ill at ease with itself. What I would say about that is that every time over the last 20 or 30 years, anybody with a long memory dismisses Germany. And we had The Economist, Sick Man of Europe in 1999. We had the criticism of Germany's car industry being asleep at the wheel and forgetting about electrification. That was quickly dealt with as well. It does eventually get there, but it is absolutely, I can't remember a time when the economic sourness and the mood was as pronounced as it is at the moment.
Really interesting. Georgie, how does it affect relations with France? It's not the backdrop that we've normally had to the French-German relationship.
The past 5 years, really, if you think about the European Union and the crisis, because we've, the Brexit negotiations and we had COVID, the war in Ukraine, and all the consequences that came out of that with the energy crisis, the economic crisis, and now this sort of security crisis, and how we think about strategically, to pick up on what Midge was saying, because that is something, you're absolutely right to talk about it, where Paris feels this is a moment where we have to think strategically about the future of the continent and tinkering around the edges and talking about how do we make EU decisions faster? Let's just drop the unanimity rule and let's do different ways of voting. That's not going to cut it. We need to have a very serious debate about what kind of Europe we want. Where are we going to have to prioritize? And is it the digital and green transformation? Is it going to be defense? Is it going to be supporting the big social crisis? Because whether it's in France or Germany, we've got an EU election coming up in June. If you look at polling, it's very clear that far-right parties are pretty much going to come top in every single member state. And one of the reasons why they're doing so well is not necessarily because they are anti-EU, but they are saying that they want to reform the EU. They want a more sovereign EU that limits the power at the central level, at the EU level, and gives more power back to national governments. Now, how they do that is they don't really answer that question. But still, I think there's a lot happening at the same time. And frankly, we need a very strong Franco-German axis on this. I think also the big difference between perhaps Macron and Olaf Scholz, because the war in Ukraine is going to be a central piece, I think, in the EU election, is that Scholz presents himself as a peace chancellor. He's like, trust me, and I will make sure that there will be no war with Russia. There will be no boots on the ground. And Macron is saying, trust me. He's saying this at the EU level, but also very much in France. And he says, trust me, and I will, we will make sure that Russia is defeated. And so it's but we will do it differently. We're prepared. We're not ruling anything out. We might have boots on the ground because actually, as soon as you place a red line, you signal your weakness. And so we can't do it. This is a very different approach to answering a very similar question. And that goes back, it's cultural, as John was saying. It's the way that they think about strategy, which is what Midge was saying. And fundamentally, it's very reflective as well of the state of national politics. And, you in France, and I think the French are always pessimistic by nature. I've learned this living here, but, they're all looking at 2027 and they're thinking, we could very much have a Marine Le Pen president. So what do we need to do now to make sure that doesn't happen? But also, and that's why Macron was very much thinking also in legacy mode. But the question is, how long can he do that? Many people think that beyond the June parliamentary EU elections, basically his soldiers will break away from him.
So as we just begin to get to the end of this podcast, let me just try and bring this together. Midge, what Georgie has just described of the very different approach between France and Germany? What does that mean, first for Ukraine, but then for where Europe takes itself?
Bronwen, I've been in the business of analysing the Franco-German relationship for 12 or so years, and I've never seen it so bad as Georgie's been saying. On Ukraine, I think Europe is fundamentally divided on the strategy. There's an agreement on the commitment to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, and you're seeing that reflected in the enlargement prospectus, the negotiation over the bilateral security guarantees, I think there is a recognition, the 50 billion that has been negotiated to support Ukraine financially until 2027 will probably need to be topped up, and that may come as early as next year, especially if support from the US dries up in 2025, assuming Donald Trump wins, which is our base case. So there's an agreement on the broad parameters of policy, but I do think there is a view in France that Scholz is simply unwilling to adjust to the new reality where American support for Europe and American support and its commitment to European security may not be assured longer term. There's a refusal of Scholz and the German coalition to engage with that reality. And the pushback, of course, from the Chancellery is Macron is being cynical and opportunistic and wants to lead without providing the euros. And if you look at this morning, Bronwen, the French fiscal deficit was announced to be 5.5% last year compared to 4.9%, feeding the view in Germany that, the economy is weak, Macron hasn't reformed it, and as I say, is looking at this leadership without providing the necessary euros. But I think Macron is thinking about legacy, not leadership, as Georgie said. In 2017, he promised to leave Europe pointing in the right direction and France pointing in the right direction. If you look at what's happening domestically with Le Pen 10 points ahead of Macron, centrist alliance running into the European elections on the 9th of June. And if you look at what's happening in Europe, I think Macron does believe a Russian victory in Ukraine would fundamentally weaken the EU, destroy its credibility, and pose a long-term security threat to the Union. So on the kind of fundamental meta-strategic question about Ukraine, there is no alignment between France and Germany, and I don't think we're going to get one in the short term. I would just say a final point, Bronwen, which is the problems with Germany, I think, are much broader than simply Ukraine. I think there is a government in Germany and a chancellor who fundamentally has no European vision or perspective. There is no real European policy of this coalition. And the team around Scholz is very different from the team that existed around Merkel in their understanding, appreciation, and patience and willingness to engage with Europe. And I think you really see that reflected in Germany's position in Europe today, which is just one country among many others defending its national interest and being quite defensive and not thinking about the historical leadership role that Germany has played in the EU. And I think France really feels that gap. And that also exacerbates and feeds these tensions that we've been talking about for quite some time.
John, this is a pretty damning account of Scholz's government and a lack of leadership in Europe. Your view of how it's going to matter in Europe?
My response is part reassuring, part not reassuring. I do think the problem resides with Scholz, and as Mitch said, with Scholz's team, particularly two members of his team. I don't actually think it resides across government. I think Boris Pistorius is doing a pretty remarkable job in what was always the graveyard shift in any German cabinet.
This is defence.
As defence minister, which has seen off several of his predecessors. Ursula von der Leyen suffered there to have a resurrection as EU Commission president. It's always been a difficult job, and he has absolutely taken it. I think others in the government are trying to push it, but Scholz has the government in an arm lock, and nobody wants the government to collapse. But in that reluctance to push things too far, they're letting Scholz's chronic and quite arrogant hesitation to have the day. I mean, the vast majority of ambassadors and diplomats and senior figures in the German foreign ministry have their head in their hands about Scholz, and privately and semi-privately are quite happy to disparage him. Just one quick parenthetic thought, and I wrote about it for the DJP only last week. The Weimar Triangle, bringing in Poland and meeting in Berlin a couple of Fridays ago, Donald Tusk was there. It obviously depends on who is in charge in Poland, but this new government under Tusk, I think, has an absolutely crucial role to play in harnessing the pro-Ukrainian elements, that's the Czech Republic particularly, and of course the Baltics and the Nordics, very much at the heart of Europe. So I think Poland has an important part to play, particularly given, as both Midge and Georgie have eloquently said, the more than strains, the pretty dire relationship between Paris and Berlin. And then just one final little thought. I'm not normally one to wave the Union flag, but I think under a changed government in the UK at the end of this year, there is an opportunity both for the EU and the UK to somehow realign, particularly on the security area. And obviously, work is being done by Starmer's people at the moment on this. But if you had a square or a rectangle of the Germans, the French, the Poles, and the Brits, I think Europe would be more cohesive and much stronger, because certainly, as we've all said, under Scholz, that's not happening.
Georgie, just a last word from you. So John's offered us a bit of reassurance. I was wondering which Union flag he was going to wave. Indeed, the UK. When you look ahead at the European elections in June, and we're going to devote a lot of time to those, what are you looking for?
I'm going to be looking at two things. The first is obviously the makeup of the European Parliament. So what we're looking at, I think pretty much certain now, is a much bigger concentration of the far right. And over the past sort of 5 years, the far right parties are sort of split in two groupings. And they've really been divided, those two groupings. So they've not got Ukraine war being one of them in relations to Russia, but there are a number of other issues on which these same members of parliament within a same group just don't get on at all. And so they've not actually been really able to affect much change or this blocking coalition of the European Parliament. But what we could have is a much more unpredictable European Parliament. So if you think of how EU policy usually works, you've got the Commission that proposes a strategy, you've got the Council that's determined by national interest, and then you used to have the European Parliament that was this sort of progressive force, federalist leap and everything else. Now you could have a European Parliament that's much more to the right, where you have coalitions that are much more unpredictable. So you'd have the centrist coalition, but at times you could have the centre-right grouping thinking, well, actually, on the green transition, maybe we'll try and form a coalition with a far-right grouping. So it makes those coalitions much more unpredictable. You'd have on the other side a council, so that's the grouping of the member state governments, much more divided. And so how do you then work around and how do you make big decisions if you've got an unpredictable European Parliament, a very divided council? Well, the sort of default over the past 5 years has been a very assertive European Commission. But we know that EU governments don't particularly want that. So I will be looking at the makeup of the European Parliament and then longer term, the relations between the institutions, which will be absolutely key in determining what the EU is actually able to do. Because if you look at polling, EU citizens are attached to the EU, but they want it to change. So it will have to act quickly.
Great, thanks for that flash into the future. We'll be looking at that a lot, as I said. But what we have arrived at is a picture of a really very complicated and divided Europe. Not so much that you would call it dysfunctional or arguing, but all kinds of questions, as John said, including about whether Poland is going to play more of a role in shaping Europe. All that to come, but we're going to have to stop now. So a huge thank you to my guests, John Kampfner, Mujtaba Rahman, and Georgina Wright. Do follow them all on X, and you can find their details in the show notes. Reminder that you can find all of our podcasts on Apple, Spotify, or major platforms, as well as through our social media. So please do like, follow, subscribe, and leave us a review. We do read them. And to read more from all of our experts, or to find out more about our events, and we have lots of those coming through the summer, don't forget to visit chathamhouse.org, and you can find there all our work, including the Europe and UK and the World programs. Goodbye. See you next week.